to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. I am super excited tonight to be joined by another blogger, vlogger, YouTuber, and one with a far greater reach than I ever dream of having. Jake Broe, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me on, Jonathan. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, and you. This is indeed our first crossing of the paths. I know that your viewership is going to know exactly who you are, and I'm pretty sure my viewership will likewise know who you are and what you're about. Do you just want to give a brief introduction as to who you are, who you were, what you were doing before you got into vlogging about this conflict, and yeah, just a little bit of background.
I'm American. I'm from the state of Wisconsin, and I am a veteran. I served for 6 years in the Air Force as a nuclear missile operations officer.
Wow.
I was a launch officer for the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile system. Stationed in North Dakota, spent some time in Alabama and California. I started a YouTube channel as a hobby, a side hustle, while I was in the Air Force, and it was doing very well. I had about 80,000 subscribers the week that Russia invaded Ukraine. And that was the exact same week I officially separated from the Air Force. I had no intention of ever being a military blogger, but I made this one-off video just giving my reaction because this was the #1 news story in the world. Video got a lot of views, gave me the incentive to make another. For a couple months, I juggled back and forth trying to talk about my regular finance and investing content, plus updates on the war. Within 2 months, my channel doubled in size, and I realized I was no longer a finance YouTuber. I was a commentator, and I've been dedicated to supporting Ukraine and helping defeat Russia for the last 2 years now.
Yeah, so what was it that spoke to you about this conflict? I mean, why the Ukraine conflict and not some other geopolitical thing?
Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons. That was my entire life for 6 years. Nuclear deterrence in the United States Air Force. The reason why we have missileers sleeping underground 365 days out of the year. There's 450 of these launch silos in North Dakota, Montana, Colorado, Nebraska. There's only one other country in the world why we do what we do, as far as the land leg of the nuclear triad. Bombers and submarines, that's enough of a nuclear deterrence. The UK and France, all they have are bombers and subs. But hardened silos, dug underground, buried in the middle of nowhere. I mean, you know why we're doing that. So, and Russia is our greatest geopolitical rival. Everybody talks about the rise of China, but Russia is, in my opinion, more reckless, more dangerous, and more ambitious.
Interesting. And this actually is prompting me to speak to you about something I was keeping for later. And that is because it's actually totally connected to what you're just saying. And I'm going to hit you with a theory that you might have heard, but actually you might tell me that theory first. What is your understanding of why Olaf Scholz in Germany has not given Taurus to Ukraine?
I actually had this conversation with General Ben Hodges. He's a retired 3-star general. So I'm going to defer to what he told me. And he lives in Germany. So he's much more comfortable and familiar with German politics. And Schultz is terrified that Donald Trump will be elected in November. And Donald Trump will withdraw from NATO and no longer offer a nuclear deterrence to Germany. France has their own nukes. The UK has their own nukes. Germany does not. So if Germany ramps up, provides Taurus, is more aggressive with their own military industrial base supporting Ukraine, and then America abandons Europe under Donald Trump, you know, Berlin gets nuked. Trump's not going to help Germany. So I think that is a political argument that somebody made to Schultz, and this is Schultz's worst nightmare. This is what he thinks about and why he's always the most reluctant to do anything when it comes to making decisions versus France or the UK.
Okay, so I'm going to hit you with I agree with that. Well, there's nothing I disagree with, but I was sent a comment by a viewer today about Taurus, and I was like, oh my god, this makes loads of sense, and it's to do with nuclear. So I'm going to hit you with it if you don't mind, mate. So
Sure.
this is from Sophie Dorian, who has said, regarding Taurus, I've been studying it up on the European and the Russian nuclear situation since the beginning of this year. Long story short, Germany better hang on to their 600 plus Tauruses. Why? They form an integral part of the nuclear strike force on the European continent. Unlike Scalp and Storm Shadow, the Taurus are bunker busters. And they both are, but I think Taurus does a much better job. Russia's nuclear weapons are protected by above ground and underground bunker complexes. Taurus are designed to render those inoperative. They are the first weapons to be launched as soon as satellite surveillance sees Russia getting within an hour or two of launching its nuclear missiles. Germany has brought the whole lot to operational status a month ago, which is actually true. We heard on the news that they had made their missiles operationally functional. So we all know about that Great Britain and France have got nukes. But seem to have forgotten that Germany has been concentrating on delivering conventional anti-nuclear weapons for decades and have all that time had a major role in the nuclear deterrent on the European continent. I'm beginning to see that what the clumsy evasion and obfuscation attempts with regard to Taurus have been innate of. It is but one of the many ways NATO member states have been trying to avoid bringing up a whole hot taboo. Schultzs, Blinken, Sunak, Macron, Verhofstadt, Michel, they have all been like Basil Fawlty of late. Don't mention the nuclear war. Schultzs being the least successful obfuscator, but by far the most successful at being Basil Fawlty. So that's a reference to British comedy show there. But I thought this was really interesting. So it's the idea that Germany, not being a nuclear state, have one chance themselves to stop a nuclear war, and that is Taurus. And if Russia go into nuclear phase, then they shoot their Taurus missiles, and that's their chance of stopping, mutually assured destruction, right? And if they give some to Ukraine, it's not about they could give some and order more. It's not about that, but it's about if Russia get hold of that missile in any way, shape, or form, they can find the technology to be able to counter that missile, and Germany then lose their ability to stop a nuclear war in their eyes. And there is no bigger thing. So that makes sense to me. What do you think about
that? I can't speak to any of the accuracy in that statement, but I think it's overthinking it. I don't think it needs to be that complicated. How many Taurus cruise missiles does Germany have in their inventory? Is it in the hundreds? Once again, Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons, and Russia hides them everywhere. They hide them on trains, they hide them on ships, they hide them in mountains, like they're on road mobiles. It's not about bunker busting or getting the silos. The silos are a very small part of Russia's nuclear arsenal. They have hypersonic bombers and they've got submarines. Like Taurus is not preventing Russia from nuking Berlin.
Interesting. So that put that theory to bed pretty well, or potentially, or at least, I get the point that actually there's a lot more ways that you can fire a nuclear missile than from a silo in a bunker. So yeah, fair cop. What are your thoughts, broadly speaking? Because obviously we have just had a weekend of really game-changing political shenanigans in the US, in your home country. What are your general thoughts on the USA package politically and in terms of how that might affect the battlefield?
I mean, I'm elated, I'm happy, but we also have to put this in context of the last 6 months, and Ukraine was robbed of time and robbed of about $30 billion worth of aid that should have flowed in over the last 6 or 7 months. Funding from Congress officially expired on October 1st of last year. Speaker Johnson and MAGA played this game. Every talking point in the book was trotted out there, but I think Donald Trump flipped on Russia because this is a losing issue. Despite their best attempts, despite the best attempts of people like Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson, the famous Putin interview, when you do polling of American people, depending on how you ask the question, but broadly speaking, do you support military aid to Ukraine from the United States? It's consistently at 60%. Trump didn't want to talk about this issue for the next 6 months leading up to the November election because it's a losing issue. So he relieved the pressure on himself because now he can just talk about domestic issues. He can talk about the border. He can talk about inflation, interest rates, wokeism, the culture wars. So Trump flipped on Russia, and he said, "I'm convinced every Republican in Congress, vote however you want to vote. I'm not telling you to do anything. If you want to vote against it, fine. If you want to vote for it, fine. I won't punish you. I won't attack you on Twitter. I won't sick my followers after you if you choose to vote for this military aid package." That released the dam. Senators like Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, basically their choke collars that Trump has on them were removed, and they went full force. I mean, this vote in the Senate was overwhelming. What was it, like
It was
82 or
79 to
79?
to an 18, was it? Which was a
79
vote
79 to
increase.
18 in the Senate is historic.
Yeah.
That's extremely bipartisan for America. That is insane how much of a consensus we got. Almost 80% on this one issue. I understand this was like a crazy bill where they lumped everything together.
Yeah.
Aid to Israel, aid to Taiwan, a ban on TikTok, the Repo Act, but I don't know if Americans living outside the bubble of people who pay attention to the war in Ukraine are aware of how significant this vote was. But this was a huge event for American politics, one of the defining moments of Joe Biden's first term in office. And if Russia has a bad winter and Russia wobbles or collapses, this week will have been the defining week of the war.
Yeah, I listened to Joe Biden's speech today, and I was really happy with that. I thought he nailed every point on it. I thought he couched Israel just right to appeal to both sides of the Israel thing. So he talked about defensively, supporting Israel with defensive aid, and then talked about humanitarian aid. So he couched that well, but he started with Ukraine. He was big on Ukraine, said all the right things. So I was really happy with how Biden saw that. Do you think the aid package is going to make a significant difference on the battlefield for Ukraine? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah. Once again, deferring to General Ben Hodges, he says that Crimea is the defining terrain of this battlefield. How is Ukraine ever going to get back the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk when they've been under more or less Russian control for a decade? Crimea is the weak point, and it's also politically the issue that will cause Putin's regime to collapse. If the bridge is destroyed, if the Russian citizens who moved to Crimea can't even get fresh drinking water or food, if they can't live life like normal, and Crimea has to be abandoned or weakened, or the dream of whatever Crimea represents to the Russian mindset, the mentality. Yeah, that's the point in which people are going to turn on Putin and realize everything's a lie. Everything's a sham. Russia's not getting their empire back.
Yeah, I think, to me, Crimea is pretty much one of the main reasons this war is taking place, because this is a map that I use as a synthesis of three mappers, a chap called Andrew Perpetua, Syriac maps, which are pro-Russian, and then deep state maps. So I've got lots of lines on it. But here is where we're at. And it's largely about Crimea. So if you have Crimea, you've got Sevastopol, which is a deep sea warm water port, doesn't freeze over in the winter, and gives you access to the Mediterranean and therefore really to the Suez Canal and out. It's so important, Crimea, for the Russians. And given that the Black Sea Fleet has then been chased out of town and is now in Novorossiysk over on this eastern coast, functionally Crimea has been reduced to Russia kind of not having it, at least as far as a naval port of note. And so I think we we undersell how well Ukraine have
But
done.
Crimea is one giant military base right now, and
Yeah.
if the United States actually sends hundreds of ATACMS over the next couple months, everything of value that Russia has positioned in Crimea is going to go boom. Spectacular booms. It's going to be very impressive to watch.
Well, this is exactly what is going to. You beat me to it. That's perfect, because I've just found out today. In my earlier video, I said that why are they announcing ATACMS if they haven't used them yet? But they actually have used them, and indeed the rumor is that they asked for they got about 100 ATACMS in February or March of the 300-kilometer variety, and if we measure that, that is how they got Jankoy, that big logistics hub and airbase and whatnot the other day. So that explains. Sorry, I got rid of that. That explains the range.
And this is very important. But at that airbase, what did they destroy? They destroyed his S-400 air defense system. They have to destroy every air defense system between here and the bridge before they can get the bridge.
Absolutely. And given that they've got those unitary warheads and they've got the cluster munitions, although the cluster munitions won't have the range, but they've certainly got the unitary warheads to pretty much hit everywhere in Crimea. And so therefore, I expect, exactly like you said, we're going to see a lot of booms taking place in Crimea, and it could be an interesting couple of weeks. I'm really quite excited about that. About the ATACMS. I mean, for me, the war, I keep saying that the war is conceptually very easy to win, right? As in, all Ukraine need are shed loads of weapons, just lots and lots of stuff and ammunition. As long as they can sort out their mobilization, those two things together with the economies of the West and the EU and US and allies, it is conceptually easy to win. Obviously, practically, you've actually got to get that stuff there, and you've got to have the political will to do that. What are your thoughts on how doable it is for Ukraine to win, and what does winning look like?
Russia's economy is slightly larger than the country of Spain. No disrespect to Spain, but Russia is not a mighty economic power or an industrial power. In order for Putin's regime to remain stable, everyone in the chain has to get paid off. Corruption is what makes Russia's current government function. So it's just very inefficient. Everything in the Russian system to fight this war is insanely inefficient because everyone's corrupt. Everyone's skimming for themselves, funneling money to their wife and kids hiding out in Dubai or Abu Dhabi. And if the West actually just wants to win, this isn't going to be competitive at all. There's so much that Western countries with significant economy sizes could do on their own to help Ukraine. Russia has a lot of people, something like 140 million. They do have a lot of natural resources, but they're so incompetent and they're so stupid and they're so arrogant. And there's no way they can win this war as long as Ukraine continues to resist, as long as they want to fight. It's a tragedy every day, seeing these missile and drone attacks on civilians, seeing Ukrainian civilians suffer. But Russia's ground forces can't advance. Whatever Putin thinks his objectives are on the ground, he's never going to achieve them. It's been over 2 years. When you get out a ruler and actually measure in the Donbass region how far they've gone, 15 kilometers. They've advanced 15 kilometers over 2 years, hundreds of thousands dead. So even if Putin doesn't care how many of his people die, but the Russian people, when they realize they're the next ones being conscripted to go die in Ukraine, there has to be a breaking point at some point where they say this isn't worth it, and they finally, people believe this day will not happen and that Russians make the best slaves in the world. But I still believe the Russian people at some point are going to revolt, and this war will probably end abruptly and unexpectedly.
I just think that the way Ukraine need to go, because as you said, Russia aren't going to advance on the ground, not without taking immense casualties. And when you look at, there's a really great tweet from Andrew Perpetua that he said today, and I think this is really important to lead into what I'm just about to say. So the more you zoom out, the more the situation looks worse for Russia. The long-term prospects are really very bad, but when you zoom into details, it flips, and Russia looks like it's in a better position. The trick is balancing the two perspectives. If you stay too focused on one or the other, you lose perspective. Both are important. The short-term advantages Russia has must be actively mitigated, and you must also understand they are short-term. If you don't take these issues seriously, bad things will happen. But at the same time, they shouldn't be taken too strongly as to imply they will last forever, because they cannot and will not. All planning at every level, from government down to volunteers, should be built around balancing along the short-term realities. And the way I understand that is that when you zoom into here, and I normally have pins on here that I've taken off, which shows, you know, some gains on the front line. So we look at Ocheretny, just in the north of Avdiivka salient. You see, oh, the Russians are making some quite significant gains over the last few days. But when you zoom out and when you understand how many they lost at Avdiivka, and you think, well, how would they take the whole of the Donbass? How would they take Odessa? Like, how would they even get to Mykolaiv here? The figures of the troops they would lose if they lost that many taking a small town in the Donbass region.
No, there's nothing logical about Russia's ground strategy. The only way Russia could ever take these major cities is if Ukraine gives them up in a negotiation. This is why people who support Russia spam this talking point. We need negotiations. We need negotiations. The reason why Russia continues to kill innocent civilians and terrorize the major urban centers is to put political pressure on Kyiv to just surrender Kharkiv, surrender Kramatorsk, give us back the city of Kherson, surrender Zaporizhia, a city of 700,000 people. But Russia never had and never will have the actual resources to take these cities by force. Kherson was the only city of significant size that the Russians took without destroying. I'm sorry, Mariupol, but they lost it. They had it.
Yeah.
Kherson peacefully basically surrendered itself in the first week or two, and then they lost it. Their only real win, you know, without destroying every building and killing every person, and they lost it. For people who support Russia, I mean, they're just lying to everyone all day, every day.
I was in Kherson in February, and it's an interesting place because it's right on the front line. Obviously, there's just a river geographically separating the front lines, and there were no military personnel inside Kherson. Right, they're all on the outskirts and all out about here, and Russia just lobs, and I was there. I had my windows rattling. My room was shaking with the reverberations of outgoing and incoming artillery. And any artillery that goes into Kherson, which happens every single day, is not hitting a military target. They are just committing terrorism, and it's so obvious there. Horrific. What I was going to say about how I think it's conceptually easy to win is to start with just having 6 months of distance munitions, standoff munitions. Like, this is why ATACMs are so important. Scalp, EG, and Storm Shadow, and anything they can get their hands on, their own indigenously made Neptune missiles, I think it's quite exciting. 1,000-kilometer range on those bad boys. If the Ukrainians can just sit back and absolutely hammer the crap out of Crimea, all the logistic routes, and then even all the air bases, get those ATACMs going on the air bases, cluster versions or unitary versions, I think that Ukraine should just sit back and absolutely throw everything they can at Russia from distance. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the most likely end for this war is some kind of political or economic collapse of Russia. I understand for a lot of Western policymakers, this is their worst fear. They don't want Russia to destabilize. They don't want the Putin regime to collapse because they're worried about loose nukes. Will some corrupt two-star Russian general or whatever sell a nuclear weapon to a terrorist organization because the ruble has gone to become worthless and the dude has to keep, affording his lifestyle? But Russia gave us no choice. Whatever future world we enter, I'm sorry, but the West didn't cause this war. NATO didn't cause this war. This war is the direct result of one delusional man, Putin, a former KGB officer who served in East Germany. And he knows he's towards the end of his life soon, and he took a shot. Can I get the old Soviet Empire back? Can I be the the hero of Russian history, the longest serving czar? You know, if Putin lives out to 2030, he will have ruled Russia longer than Joseph Stalin did. Putin just was the richest man in the world who had everything he ever wanted. And when you get to that level, where do you go from there?
Yeah, because
And
he's got something like 11 super yachts. And I always think, when the hell are you going to get on your super yacht? What's the point of having one more super yacht? Like, when are you don't even leave your palace. Like, so what, you know, if you've got everything, you have no need for anything materially, then it all becomes about some abstract sense of who you are and what your legacy is.
and towards the beginning of this full-scale invasion, Putin frequently talked about, you know, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, and you know, he sucks at history. He's really bad at it, but he genuinely was trying because he says, "I'm one of them. There's going to be statues of me in shitty small towns in Siberia that don't have running water, but I want statues of me in those impoverished towns, people thinking of me and thanking me for getting back the Baltics, getting back Finland, getting back Ukraine, getting back Kazakhstan or whatever, you know, for the glory of the empire." That's what this whole entire war is about.
So does that mean you think that rather than, well, not rather than, it's not a false dichotomy of either or, but do you think it's just important that the Ukrainians continue to hammer away at the refineries to hit Russia economically, or do you think they should stick to military targets?
I 100% agree that oil refineries are military targets. Oil
Yeah.
refinery revenue funds the military. Refined oil products feed the military, gasoline and diesel. So these are legitimate targets. These are not private companies. The people who own and operate these refineries are part of Putin's regime. They serve Putin at all times.
Yeah,
So
the US law of war manual says that refineries and oil, you know, power stations, I think, are generally and usually seen as military targets. So yeah.
I want to, well, I haven't talked about this yet in a video, but there's
Mhm.
something called Operational Tidal Wave. US bombers taking off from Libya bombed oil depots and refineries in Bulgaria that served the Nazi war machine. So there's plenty of historical precedents, very famous events of the United States bombing oil depots and refineries to defeat their enemies. So yes, there's a historical precedent for this. But going back to a point I want to make about Putin,
Mm.
and I think we're all spoiled. I think everybody living in the year 2024, we're all spoiled in that we live in this post-age of empires. The British Empire, I'm sorry, you had to give up your holdings, the French Empire. But empires were the natural state of human civilization for 10,000 years. Didn't matter if it was Central America, Southeast Asia, Africa, Europe, Genghis Khan. As soon as humans figured out how to make surpluses of food, they made huge armies and they just would attack and conquer their neighbors to expand their territories. The second that we had kings and potentates, this is a universal principle of human nature because it happened everywhere for over 10,000 years. So when World War II happened, 50 million people dead, some very smart people got together, and you could say it began with something called the Bretton Woods Agreement. This was the post-World War II agreement that took place in Bretton Woods, and the United States told the economies of France, Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, we're done with empires. This sucks. This kills everybody. So we're going to try something different. And the United States tried to build this new international system. And there's plenty of fair criticism to how the United States enforced that system over the last 70 or 80 years. But what Putin and Xi and Iran and North Korea want to do is they want to go back to the natural state. They want to go back to the default. Rich men getting richer. They're bored with how rich they are. and they just want to expand their empires. There's this pull. They're trying to pull us back to the pre-1945 Bretton Woods period, going back to the age of empire. So I think every person in the world needs to, and I understand most people's knowledge of history generally is pretty bad, but we all need to have this serious discussion. Do we want to go back to the age of empires and these constant, continuous, endless wars?
Yeah, and you could argue that places like China are wanting their kind of new empires. I think it was Guy Verhofstadt wrote a book on how Europe needs to be competing in this age of new empires, where the US is its own imperial kind of thing, like economic empire, and you've got the China BRICS, maybe Russia is an Eastern empire, and the EU needs to work out what it needs to be in this competing world stage. But yeah, I mean, it's getting pretty scary, I think. Now I find it really interesting that one, the US has agreed this aid, and they've done it pretty convincingly now. And I think probably on the back of Mike Johnson, among other things, I think he was convinced by Ukrainian Christians, I think was an interesting bit of influence that hit him. But I also think he saw the intel and had a bit of a moment where he realized how bloody important this is. The UK today and yesterday has just said it's going to increase its defense spending by 75 billion pounds over 6 years, and it's going to put its military industrial complex on a war footing. We've got Emmanuel Macron saying similar things and being really strong on the rhetoric. Like, it feels to me like we are entering this new age of a militaristic age of we are pretty much in a world war. What are your thoughts on whether we're in a world war? Is it a distinction that matters or not?
Well, if it's a world war, it's democracy versus autocracy. It's countries where people have freedom of speech and freedom of the press to some degree, and countries that have zero freedom of press and freedom of speech. I hate Elon Musk for his hypocrisy when he tweets constantly about being this defender of free speech, but he never talks about the people of Russia not having any free speech, the people of Iran not having any free speech, the people of North Korea or China having no free speech, no individual rights. And I think there was this hope when the Soviet Union collapsed that we could all get along. As long as everyone agreed to stay within their own borders and not attack their neighbors, then the United States was fine. Doing business, free trade, bilateral agreements, whatever, with dictators. The rule was you can do whatever you want to your own people in your own country. Uyghur genocide, bombing Chechnya, destroying, the Russians destroyed Grozny. If you do it to your own people in your own country, we're not going to be happy. We might pass some UN General Assembly resolutions condemning you, but we're not going to stop you. The one rule that democracies around the world had is you can't attack your neighbors. You can't redraw the lines. And these dictators are not willing to agree to that rule. So I'm sorry, it sucks. We're all going to have higher inflation. We're all going to have higher central bank interest rates. The economic situation is not going to be as gravy as it was during the 90s and 2000s. But yeah, China's a serious problem.
Yeah, I think that's interesting.
Russia's a serious problem.
Where I think many of us are looking too individualistically. So we've got used to this very comfortable material existence in the Western world, where you're thinking, hang on, if we're supporting Ukraine in that war, how's that affecting me at the petrol pump? Oh, I'm not too sure about that. No, I'm going to vote that we don't help Ukraine because it's going to affect my inflation. It's like, whoa, we need to be thinking a little bit bigger than this. It's about international security. It's about securing our nation and our children going into the future. And so I think there are these big things happening. And also, sorry, you were going to say something.
It's human nature to take the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
When you can, I mean, just conserving energy, how humans evolved, we want the maximum gain for the minimum efforts. So when a group of people, a faction, or a strongman comes along offering easy solutions in simple catchphrases and slogans, it's very tempting for people to follow that person, follow that message. He's promising it's easy. Donald Trump says he can fix this war, end this war in 24 hours. He's not giving any details, but there is a certain percentage of people who will just say, all right, I'll vote for that guy and give it a shot. He promises he can fix it in 24 hours. But yeah, it's difficult for people like me and people like you to make the longer, more detailed, more complicated historical arguments that appeasing Russia and China today, because you're upset about the price of gasoline, is going to potentially lead to the deaths of millions of our citizens, millions of people living in NATO countries. If Russia expands, get bigger, attacks a NATO country, and this leads to a real nuclear war. It's frustrating, but people like you and I, we can't stop beating the drum and repeating ourselves and trying to reach these people who gravitate towards the dumbest, easiest solutions.
Absolutely. There's a whole bunch of questions for you in your live chat. Before I get to some of them, then that leads me on to the thing that has been concerning me an awful lot, as much as the war concerns me, in the terrible nature of human conflict and the deaths and the war crimes, and it's horrific. But with that war, so Russia's looking at the war and they say, right, if the West help Ukraine, if the Allies help Ukraine as much as they might be able to, we've got absolutely no chance of winning a conventional war. So if we are going to prevail in this conventional war, we have to stop the Allies supporting Ukraine, because if it's just the Ukraine and their industrial output, we can beat them in a conventional war. So half of the war at the moment is trying to unseat the politicians in allied nations who are supporting Ukraine. So it's about politicians in the EU who are for the EU and EU unity. It's about at the moment, it seems, because it's become partisan in the US for no sensible reason, it's about trying to get certain politicians in, amplify the message of Marjorie Taylor Greene over the message of the Democrats or whatever. And so Russia is fighting a political war with disinformation as much as it's fighting a military war with tanks and guns. And you and I, we are on the front lines of the information war, in the information spaces doing the battling. Is disinformation something that worries you as much as it freaks me out when I see like the voting's going to be changed in the upcoming European elections and possibly in November?
Yes, Russia understands its limitations, and to be honest, we're seeing how warfare is different. Russia built their military based on how World War II was fought. All these tanks and armored vehicles, but given drones, given landmines, given precision artillery, it's really hard to advance, both for Ukraine and for Russia. Ukraine never had proper air superiority. We can say that's the reason why their summer counteroffensive last year failed. But at the same time, they did liberate 50% of the territory that Russia once controlled in the Kharkiv region and Kherson. So Russia understands the power of ideas and the information sphere. They're happy if people just tune out, switch off, stop paying attention. They consider that a win. But once again, it's about making these simplified, easy arguments that people can understand and people can repeat in a comment, 1 or 2 sentences, just make it as simple as possible. Repeat, 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 repeat. And people do get tired. They do get exhausted. So, yeah.
I just think I'm so... I hate when people... I mean, my background is a philosopher of religion, right? And I'm a skeptic who's always trying to argue, or always used to be big on arguing. Like, if you are in any way wrong, I need to make sure you understand how you are wrong about your view of reality or whatever. I'm a little bit more chilled out now. But when people are spreading disinformation, when they're doing it purposefully, that absolutely gets my goat. It really gets me going. And to fool people into believing outright lies just really damn triggers me. So when I see like people standing up in Congress and spouting actual Russian propaganda lines, literally lines that were written for them. When Marjorie Taylor Greene gave an amendment to the bill that talked about Hungarians in Transcarpathia, you know damn well she didn't write that, and that's not coming from her brain, and it worries the hell out of me. I think we live in much more a fragile existence, politically speaking, than we give credit for.
I know in other parts of the world it's different. America's democratic system is entirely flawed because we have something called first past the post voting, meaning
I rage about this all the time because it comes from Britain, because we exported that around the world. Ugh.
Well, all you have to do is have the most votes and you get the seat. So let's say 3 people run. One person gets 34%, one person gets 33%, one person gets 32%. The person who got 34 gets the seats, and the other 66% of people are unhappy. So there's this incentive to consolidate, to get big. This is why the United States only has 2 political parties, and the election results are always 51-49, 48-52. So we have these team politics where if you can co-opt one of the parties on your issue, everyone else in the Democratic Party or everyone else in the Republican Party will just adopt your position to be a team player. So there's lots of people who don't care about abortion, but they really care about having automatic weapons and gun rights. So they will adopt the positions politically of the people that they're allied with in their party. It's the same thing on the Democratic side, considering LGBTQ rights or environmental rights or other issues that liberals versus conservatives. So what Russia did was very smart. Infiltrating the Republican Party, getting to certain members, because they repeat their propaganda talking points, and now tens of millions of people in America who identify as Republican, identify as conservative, they just adopt the position because they want to be a team player in the party. Donald Trump is the reason for this, and we've now poisoned the minds of tens of millions of Americans. You see these Trump rally interviews of people saying Putin's not a bad guy. NATO is the one who started this war. Putin just wants peace. Why aren't we negotiating? It's a miscarriage of political justice. When I can show pictures and videos of hospitals being blown up and dams being blown up, it's obvious who the aggressor, who the evil force is. And it's just really sad. It's just really sad that tens of millions of Americans are now lost politically. And we're seeing pushback. I don't know if you saw this clip of Mitch McConnell. Yeah. Mitch McConnell's the minority Republican leader of the Senate. And he called out Tucker Carlson. He said,
"Yep, brilliant.
Tens of millions of Republicans are now thinking Russia are the good guys because of this idiot Tucker Carlson pushing Kremlin propaganda on his TV show for a decade." As an American, it's just incredibly sad. I genuinely pity these people.
And I think you're absolutely right. I think when you have first past the post voting system, it means that you can have in Britain where it's like yourself actually. So if you had a third party being voted, getting 10% in every single state in the US, the same in every constituency in the UK. So you got one party that only ever got 10%. But they got it in every single constituency. They would not get they wouldn't get the biggest votes in each constituency, so they didn't get anyone in. But 10% of the country voted for them, and 10% of the country therefore have no representation. So, which is why you need some form of proportional representation. But it means that it's for so many issues, people are not being represented in the political system with only 2 parties, and it becomes this big polarized mass of like, well, I'm a one-issue voter, as so many people are. I think in America, I wrote an article on that years ago. But they then, as you say, they're in with one issue, and then you have to suck in all the other issues to as they are in that party. That all the other issues are are kind of stapled on, and so it just becomes a really difficult political system to try and overcome. Or
I
try
think
and
the
improve.
purest I think the purest form of democracy that I've seen is the Netherlands. I think
Yeah,
their national government, I think it's 150 seats, but it's just you vote for the party. The parties have a list of candidates based on priority. So depending on how many seats they get, these people will be seated. I think there is a 3% threshold. You have to get at least 3% to get, well, it'd be like 4 seats or whatever based on 150. But I wish the United States had proportional representation and you had to form coalition governments. It would just breed more understanding and cooperation and dialogue, and it'd be more fair, I think.
yeah.
Uh, but the Constitution's 240 years old. It's impossible to amend. We're never changing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I rail about this all the time. I've spoken a lot about proportional representation. Someone's asking a question that's sort of to do with that. So Christopher here says, Jake, most Americans don't know or care about this war. How do we increase interest? I don't know if that's something you know how to
Well, I
answer.
mean, individuals can do everything they can. You know, on Twitter this morning, I retweeted this Nissan dealership in Texas that had the biggest Ukrainian flag I've ever seen flying above the car dealership. So there are small things you can do for visibility, but I I I don't think we need every person paying attention and engaged. We just need them not supporting Russia.
Yeah.
uh, but I don't fault people who don't pay attention, who don't tune into the news. The average person, most places in the world, they're just trying to survive. They're just trying to go to work, earn a paycheck, take care of their family, take care of their parents, whatever. But uh,
That's why
it,
we have representative democracy, because you vote for someone. You don't have time to worry about all these things. So you vote for
yeah,
someone that should have the wherewithal to get expertise on these subjects. So it's even more frustrating when you vote for that person and they're dumb as a box of rocks on any given subject.
yes. It's impossible for every person to be fully informed on every issue that
Yeah.
the country needs in order to function. It's just, I can't even do it. So for the average person not paying attention, they're still good people. If I were to sit down with them and have a 30-minute conversation, giving them the basic facts and evidence, assuming they're not in denial or been corrupted by Russian disinformation, the average person will come to a consensus with me. Ukraine should be supported. Russia's the bad guy. This is in America's best interest.
Absolutely. So thanks to Scott Nolan for a super sticker. Really very kind of you, my friend. A question for you, Jake. So Eubanks DVDs, because obviously you've cast your opinion on this before and you have some nuclear skills and knowledge. A couple of months back, Jake suggested Ukraine should be allowed to facilitate uranium enrichment. What's his thoughts now? What are your thoughts now? Can you just quickly explain uranium enrichment and then
So he made a mistake. I didn't actually advocate for Ukrainian enrichment, but you can make a nuclear weapon from plutonium, which is a byproduct of civilian nuclear power. So Ukraine still has 4 civilian nuclear power plants. Plutonium is a byproduct of the energy generation process. You can mess with that to make a nuclear weapon. So yeah, I did make this argument probably like 2 months ago, that if the United States doesn't want to militarily help Ukraine anymore, then Ukraine is in their rights to develop a crude nuclear weapon and use it for their own defense. If the Russians were genuinely advancing towards their capital city of Kyiv, they would. Why wouldn't they do everything in their own power to stop Russia and defend their territory, defend their people? So I was making that hypothetical argument to put political pressure on the United States to pass this military aid package. Because the aid package passed, I don't think the situation is dire enough where Ukraine needs to do that. But I did want to point out that Ukraine always has this possibility if they feel that they've been abandoned by the West.
Do you think that Russia wouldn't have invaded had they still had nuclear arms? Like,
Absolutely, Russia would not have invaded.
Yeah, and it's interesting that that calculus is apparently at play, or it seems to be the best explanation for why we went and supported. That's the US, UK, Jordanians. We went and supported Israel by shooting down drones and missiles from Iran coming into Israel because Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. So hey, we can go and do that. What they can do. Whereas we're not prepared to do that with Russia because, well, the only real differentiation there is that they've got nuclear weapons. So that tells us, we can learn from this, that nuclear weapons are an effective deterrent.
And this selective enforcement of defending democratic countries is dangerous because we're sending the message to the world, if you get nukes, well, then you can attack whoever you want. We won't do anything.
Exactly.
But if you don't have nukes, we're going to stop you.
Yeah,
that's
definitely.
That's not a good message to send to dictators around the world.
Yeah. Aussie T, thank you for gifting a membership. The Weasel, 10 memberships. That's awesome. Thank you very much. Right. Renan Diaz Reno says, with this aid, do we risk running into an over-optimism like the one people had over Ukraine's last year's summer counteroffensive? I suppose that there's a couple of things in there. So could we be over-optimistic? And what was it that didn't work for the last year's counteroffensive, in your opinion?
I do think it was easier to make videos in support of Ukraine back in 2022, given that the Russians fell flat on their face with their full-scale invasion. In April, they gave up on the north. They pulled out of Chernihiv. They pulled out of Chernobyl. We then fast forward to September, a couple months later, Kharkiv counteroffensive, tens of thousands of square kilometers liberated. Fast forward to November, the city of Kherson and the North Bank was all liberated. So the Russians pulled off Snake Island, the sinking of the Moskva flagship. In 2022, we had all of these seminal moments of Russia just humiliating itself and Ukraine outperforming expectations. So yes, I agree that we were overly optimistic about the summer counteroffensive last year, but Russia spent a year digging trenches and laying landmines, and Ukraine never had enough men and resources, and especially air superiority, to ever do the proper combined arms tactics to actually break through the Sorovikin lines.
Yeah,
and honestly, I think even General Zaluzny at the time knew it, and he still had to try for political reasons. But
well, he did admit in the I think the Economist article, or one of his subsequent pieces, that he admitted to the mistake. He said, the mistake I had is thinking that we could advance 30 kilometers a day. 30 kilometers a day is a vastly quick move, and that means that he was genuinely expecting on that southern front line to do a Kharkiv counteroffensive style thing. You just break through their front lines, and then you're through, job done. But actually the sheer volume of fortifications means that would have just been impossible.
Yeah, it was possible. Ironically, MAGA Republicans blocking military aid for Ukraine has taken all of the pressure off the Ukrainian military to perform well. Every defeat, everything that's gone wrong, well, you can just say MAGA Republicans cut off military aid from the United States. So I think expectations are low right now. We just want Ukraine to stop allowing Russia to advance, one tree line at a time every couple days or whatever. This isn't a huge accomplishment for the Russians, but he is correct. But I don't think anyone is saying, okay, this aid package passed, Ukraine's going to make it to Berdansk, in 3 months or whatever. Nobody is saying that. Ukraine needs to stop the bleeding, make the Russians pay, get Crimea into a really bad place for the civilian population. So there's political panic and pressure on the Kremlin. But we need to hunker down and get through this winter. Given the cascade of utility failures, I think things in Russia this winter are going to be even worse domestically. And we just need things to get as bad internally in Russia as possible.
on the point you were just making, or a similar point, I read something today, really interesting, that you can see a silver lining to the cloud of 7 months of not having any aid from the US. And there are two arguments. At least until the end of 2024, we are provided with full-fledged military supplies from the United States. So as a result of the failure to get aid in 7 months, now they've actually got it, and they've got they've got a sort of big enough amount, then actually that's going to last longer because Ukraine have been able to sustain themselves just about. But the second more important point is that Europe, as a result of the US not doing anything for 7 months, or only giving small PDA aid packages, Europe has actually woken up and taken responsibility for a lot of the defense of Ukraine. So you can make some interesting arguments to say that possibly in hindsight, the 7 month delay from the US could have resulted in a better situation now, although that's 7 months of pain. So I don't, but it's some interesting points though. Like, had the US turned up with a massive aid package 7 months ago, the Europe would probably still be faffing around.
There's a really interesting concept in business called lean efficiency, and this is from Japanese automotive makers in the 1980s. So in the 1980s, car companies like Toyota and like Mitsubishi, maybe, they deliberately would fire 10% of their staff, like every year, or cut the budget of certain departments, and then they would tell them your output has to remain the same. You have to keep performing on last year's levels with 10% less resources. So they would deliberately force people to become more efficient. And what happened with military aid from the United States being blocked the last 7 months is Ukraine had to find a way to make themselves more efficient in order to survive. This trickles down to every level of the supply chain, from people 3D printing drones looking for cheaper materials or a better vendor or whatever. But Ukraine, now that the aid is resuming, is in a better position if the aid had always been there, basically, because they were forced to. Now, that came at a cost. I'm not saying it's a good thing in that, running out of air defense missiles caused the Kyiv electric power plant to be destroyed. That's going to cost like $1 billion to repair after this war is over. But more negatives than positives, but there is still a positive.
Yeah, that's well said. Well said. Thank you to Power Andy for the super sticker. Very kind of you, mates. And Julian Rossiter, or JP, Jake. Do you think there are plans in place, to secure Russian nukes if the Federation falls apart?
God, I hope so. I hope so. And no one's going to like this answer, but if, let's say, Russia breaks out into civil war and starts falling apart, I genuinely think the United States would go to China and say, hey, can you help? Can you, over your land borders, go into Russia and secure some of these sites? Sure, with helicopters or special ops teams, maybe we can get some Western countries, the United States, to go in and get some, but this is going to be a nightmare. This is going to be an absolute nightmare, trying to track these down and secure them safely so that they don't fall into the hands of smaller states or terrorist organizations. There is an interesting historical example. It's called Operation Sapphire. If anybody wants to Google it, basically, this was 1993. So the Soviet Union had collapsed. Russia was in really bad shape. And the United States couldn't get a hold of Russia. Russia just wasn't picking up the red phone. Boris Yeltsin was struggling once again to coalesce this new country separate from the USSR. And Kazakhstan found all of this nuclear material. We had enriched uranium ore and ingot material, like tons of it. And so the United States couldn't get a hold of the Russians. And we decided to send this special ops force into Kazakhstan to secure all this nuclear material. We just did it, when normally this should have been returned to Russia. That was the agreement. But given that it was there, we knew what it was. We didn't want to mess around with, whoever was holding on to it at the time, selling it to somebody. So yeah, we just went in and got it. Didn't ask the Russians for permission.
Them were the days. I'm surprised there hasn't been some films made about that, or a series.
I'd love to see a movie about Project Sapphire. When I learned about that, I said, "This is a cool story. Like, this should be more well known."
Yeah, it's. I was just looking at a wiki page, and it's features on episode 7 of Turning Point, which is a really good Netflix documentary series. I haven't got to
I haven't
episode 7
watched
yet.
that yet. I need to. I'm gonna write that down. I need to watch that.
Yeah,
I've
Turning
heard about
Point,
it.
the bomb and the Cold War. Yeah, it's a long series. There are some big old episodes in there, but it is packed full. In fact, there's a number of people who you will know from the information space that we operate in with regard to the Ukraine war who are in on that one. Thank you for. I don't never know whether this is Guitar Horse, Guitar Horse. I don't know. It's my two favorite Ukrainian YouTubers there. So thanks for that, matey. Really appreciate that. Richard Bennett gifting 5 memberships. Thanks, Richard. Always a pleasure, never a chore having you around. Stephen Bendal with some Norwegian love says, "It's great to see my two favorite YouTubers together. One, though, according to Timothy Snyder, defeat in this war is Russia's only hope." So just trying to work that out. So why should the Western world be afraid of that outcome? So let's go through that. One thought, according to Timothy Snyder, defeat in this war is Russia's only hope.
I think he means for the Russian people, what is their best outcome in the future world, and it's to be free of the Putin regime. If the people of Russia ever want to taste real freedom and have real economic prosperity, Russia has to be militarily defeated for them to give up on their lingering ambitions of reconstituting their empire. I've interviewed and talked to a lot of Russians. There's the Russian dude. He lives in Toronto.
Yeah.
There's Zach the Russian. He participated in protests in St. Petersburg the first week, almost got arrested, fled the country, was hiding out in Georgia. He then got a student visa, and he's here in the United States now. He's in South Carolina, going to college, or North Carolina. And I know there's countless, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of young Russians who have fled the country. And for them to return home and to help their society, help their people have a better, prosperous future, Timothy Snyder is correct. Russia has to be defeated on the battlefield.
Yeah. Well, I always say that in order for us to win this information war that we're involved in, Ukraine has to win on the battlefield. Like we can't hope to win the disinformation wars that we're having, that interfering with our electoral systems and our democratic processes and institutions. We can't hope to win this without Russia being every kind of attempt to work against disinformation is like a sticking plaster. Truth travels 6 times slower than disinformation. So we can't undo disinformation easily. What we need to do is stop that disinformation being propagated by the source. So we need Russia to lose in this war, so there's a regime change, so they aren't spending all of their time. Because I've said before that Russia have spent how many billions of dollars on this war? If they just banked all of that money, just all the money they spent on this war, and then spent it on troll farms, right? They would have done far more damage to the US and to the Western world than the war they're involved in.
To your point, history is written by the victors. And if Russia were to win, they would erase all evidence of their crime, and they would plant evidence or repeat the lies that, look at all the Nazis we found in Ukraine and their secret Nazi shrines. And look, we found the biolabs where they were torturing ethnic Russians in the Donbass region to extract their DNA to make the super weapons that were going to kill they would do this nonsense if they actually won, took control of Ukraine. I've made this point that one of the biggest incentives for supporting Ukraine is to stop Russia from Russifying the people and then conscripting all the Ukrainian men saying, hey, you're Russian now in the Suit up, you're going to go attack Poland now. And Ukrainians respond, we would never do that. We would never willingly fight for the Russians. And I said, well, if Russia controls your country and all your information for 5 years and repeats these lies over and over,
Yeah.
I do think actually the average Ukrainian man, because Russia would highlight the betrayal of the West. They set you up for this war. They never fully supported you. All your cities that were destroyed and your people who were killed, it's because America abandoned you, that evil American empire. And your neighbors, the Polish, look at those border blockades. They never supported you. They were never going to help you win. Poland never had your back. Now go get in that tank and attack Poland.
I really agree with you, actually. Yeah, I think human minds are just very vulnerable. We think we would see right and see truth and be great moral actors with some kind of omniscience, but actually the reality is that people get clouded by the information spaces they're in. And if you are in a country, like you look at the Russian public at the moment, and it's only due to the internet and the ability to have VPNs that some Russian population are able to understand the real context. But if you completely control Russia wants to have its own internet that is a closed system and not connected to the world, precisely because they want to control that information so much.
That's what North Korea has. North Korea has an intranet.
Yeah, and that's how it works. Jake, Broe, when exactly did you change your mind about Russia? You've talked about your change evolution towards a realization of just how much Russia is a terrorist state. Was there a tipping point?
I have mentioned this in previous podcasts that when I was serving underground as a missileer, I was sitting there in the launch control capsule thinking, this is stupid. Why are we still doing this? I genuinely believed, and I have serious guilt about these beliefs now. When I was sitting underground in 2019 and 2020 and 2021, I said to myself, Russia's never going to do anything. Russia's never going to attack anyone. Like, why would they? They're getting rich, selling their oil, selling their gold, selling their agriculture. The oligarchs, sure, it's a corrupt country. It's not a real democracy. But why would the Russians go to war with their best customers? All of their pipeline infrastructure flows west to Europe. Why would they attack Europe? That would screw up their good deal. And I underestimated how irrational Putin is and delusional they were to think that this would be easy, because they only did this because they thought this would be easy.
Yeah. Just on going back to nuclear, there's a couple of nuclear questions. People are obviously knowing your expertise here. Here is one of them. If you had to guess, what do you think the condition is of Russian nuclear weapons?
People ask me this all the time, and I say it doesn't really matter. Let's say the failure rate, let's say Putin hits the big red button and wants to launch everything in a preemptive strike. It doesn't matter if the failure rate is 50%. Russia makes up for their incompetence with quantity. Yeah. So the Russian war machine model has always been mass over precision. So they don't care if half of them fail or blow up on the launch pad. If they have 6,000, 3,000 go, they're still going to, destroy the Northern Hemisphere.
And I don't know, I'm sure you're aware there are big floods in Russia at the moment, and there are floods in the Kurgan region where there are old uranium mines, and there's talk about there being lots of radioactive flood water. What's the effect of radioactive flood water, as you would understand it, in these areas of Russia? Some people on my threads are saying actually it's not an issue, it would seep through the ground and blah, blah, blah. I don't know.
Well, most people get very concerned when they hear about radioactivity, but radioactivity is normal. There are lots of isotopes of different elements that have their natural half-lives. They decay. There's 2 stable isotopes of uranium that decay at different rates, but there's uranium in everything. There's uranium in my camera, there's uranium in my desk. There's just such a small amount that it doesn't matter. And in those uranium atoms, there are the 2 stable radioactive isotopes that ping, 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 giving off alpha particles. at a consistent rate based on their half-lives. But it's such a small quantity, it doesn't mean anything. It's only when you enrich uranium and you concentrate it and you put it all together, that stuff is not safe to handle with your bare hands or breathe in, get it into your lungs, or ingest somehow. But as far as a uranium mine, this is a deposit of concentrated uranium ore, but the uranium ore has not been enriched. It's not more deadly than the average rock. So flooding of uranium mines actually is not a big deal. Don't drink the stuff. Don't drink that water. It's going to have slightly higher levels of those isotopes that do give off natural background radiation, but it's not a serious threat.
Thanks for that, Herb. Great question. And Darren Corrigan says, what would it take to fully arm Ukraine? I mean, can it be calculated? What do you think would be the key areas? I mean, he asks again later, will Ukraine get air superiority at any time in this war? So that might have something to do there. People talking about F-16s and whatnot. Will the US also deliver aircraft beside F-16, also A-10s, Apaches would be interesting, says Elmer Hess.
It got really interesting in January, February, March, when Ukraine had this one roving Patriot launcher going back across the front lines, shooting down these A-50s and these F-35s, these MiG-20. Like, Ukraine was getting a plane like basically every other day. And that stopped. That stopped well over a month ago because Ukraine ran out of missiles. So I'm excited. Once they get a refresh of missiles, they're first going to protect their cities.
Is that what you think it was? Missiles? Because I thought they lost a couple of launchers just behind Avdiivka, and I was wondering whether that was what made them get a little jittery. But I still think they ran
out of missiles. They didn't have the surplus as much as they wanted to go hunting for the Russian planes firing off these glide bombs. They couldn't justify, and Russia knows that too. That's why Russia attacks civilians consistently, to draw Ukraine's air defenses off the front to protect their civilian cities. But when the refresh comes, I guarantee you the United States is going to send another 2 or 3 complete battery systems in the next month. Ukraine is going to dedicate one to once again roving the front lines, hunting these MiGs and these Su-35s or whatever, firing off these glide bombs.
You think they're going to get that many? There's a Kuleba, Dmitry Kuleba, the foreign minister for Ukraine, reported here in The Guardian, says Kuleba also said Ukraine had identified 7 Patriot air defense systems it could use to protect civilians in major cities outside Kyiv. 1 had been obtained from Germany, 4 more have been located, and negotiations were taking place, Kuleba said, and 2 more were in his sights. It's all very vague. Press reports indicate that Greece and Spain are considering whether to supply Patriots, while Poland and Romania would also own the batteries. Kuleba added that an 8th system could come from the US. Quote, I think the US Army probably has 1 spare, he said. Negotiations to obtain these were complicated because, quote, countries who operate the Patriots bargain for backfill and compensation, Kuleba said. But he added, I'm in no doubt, given the progress we are making, that Patriots will arrive, and Germany must be commended for making the first move. So you think, you genuinely think the US is going to turn up with them?
No doubt. I mean, the first Patriot battery will be announced within this month. But I know they did allocate more money for training. Training for Ukrainian defenders on the Patriot system is in Oklahoma. So I think they're also going to announce another group of 60 or 100 or whatever are going to go to Oklahoma. I think, the first 2 groups that went through the Oklahoma training, there's also training in Spain, but I think Ukraine is using them as instructors to double up knowledge, but it still is best if Ukrainian defenders are sent to the proper training facilities. They can go through the simulators as opposed to the real thing in the field. But yeah, I imagine the first ones that went through the Patriot training are now the trainers for if they do get additional systems, the basic stuff like, hey, this is how you do this. And I give so much respect and credit to the Ukrainians having to learn all these different systems on the fly and then keep it all going on their own.
Yeah. Volcano says more important question is, will the US provide cruise missiles for the F-16s? We've heard nothing about this, and Ukrainians can't rely on Storm Shadows forever.
Well, Storm Shadow and Scalp are cruise missiles fired from planes, but ATACMS are better. You can fire that from an M270 or a HIMARS. You don't need cruise missiles, and ATACMS serve the same purpose, but I argue if it's ground launched, it's easier to hide, easier to move around, and you don't need a vulnerable, expensive jet to take off in the air.
Yeah, actually, well, so I would say that the warheads, the broach warheads on, say, the Storm Shadow that have this two-part thing are good for bunker busting. But actually, the ATACMS, if they have ballistic trajectory, they're not going to be shot down as easily as, say, a cruise missile potentially. I don't know actually, but I think that both got the pros and cons. But I think what's going to be fascinating, going back to ATACMS, is Sevastopol, like the ships that are left there, and there are a number of naval ships, quite a few that are still in that port. I just think it's prime for ATACMS to just like bosh. I'd be super excited if I was a HIMARS operator right now in Ukraine in the south. But, yeah.
Yeah, I imagine for the HIMARS and the M270 crews, they're licking their chops. They're getting their vacation days out of the way now, because as soon as they have material, they have the weapons, it's go time, and they're going to be working around the clock. As soon as they get the target lists and the coordinates and the instructions, I mean, I'm sure these guys are jacked up, ready to go. They know how important, how big of a difference this is going to make in the next month.
Absolutely. This to me is a super important question, because I think I said like probably a year and a half ago, maybe at the beginning of the war, I wrote an article within the first month of war. I think it might have even been the first week when they realized they couldn't get to Kyiv within 3 days. I was like, right, Russia can't win this war. There's no way they can occupy a whole country that doesn't want them to be there. And as soon as they realized that the Ukrainians didn't want them to be there, they're like, oh, we'd planned for a special military operation. I genuinely think they planned for a special military operation, a 3-day, switch the government out, put their own puppets in, clear up for 2 weeks, and get your parade uniforms on, and there you go. And then the Ukrainians went, hang on, guys, sod off. And they were like, oh, we're expecting flowers. And they just weren't, they didn't have a plan for a war. And then they accidentally ended up in a war, and ridiculous situation. But I have long said the only way that Russia can prevail in this war militarily is if they get the outright support of China, because then you have, China and Russia against everyone else. But then actually, I think everyone else would kick in. But I'd say that's their best bet. How do you feel about China, and how do you feel about blocking Chinese aid? Because we are seeing them aid Ukraine a lot more at the moment.
China is not giving direct military aid. They're still providing components. They're still providing non-lethal aid, like med kits and food and MREs. They're providing, the
it's a
stupid
satellite intelligence that I think is a big problem. So I'm fairly sure that when we've started seeing an uptick of better targeted attacks on Ukraine and time-sensitive attacks of certain armaments that they weren't hitting regularly before, but now Russia's starting to hit regularly, I think the big change has been Russia. I'm speculating, but there are claims that they are definitely providing satellite imagery. I think that's a massive aid.
China has everything to lose and almost nothing to gain by Russia's stupid war. The military partnership, I mean, when you compare China and Russia, Russia's a joke. China, their economy is 10 times larger than Russia. Their population is 10 times larger than Russia. So the only value the Russians had was their military experience and their military technology. So the Chinese entertained this equal partnership because the Russians were supposed to be good at war. And Russia can't even take the Donbass region. Even with the United States not helping for 7 months, Russia still couldn't even take the Donetsk Oblast. So I'm sure the Chinese are just looking at the Russians like, why are we equal? Like, why is this an equal partnership? And if China started feeding lethal aid to the Russians, well, the Russians are now the proxy of a proxy war. If Ukraine is the proxy of the West, it's Russian citizens dying. It's Russia being the proxy of China. And what does China gain from that? What does China gain from using Russia as their proxy in a war against Europe and North America when Europe and North America are China's largest trading partners? They love doing business with China, with North America and Europe. So China knows they're vulnerable. China and Russia's starting positions on this war map are not the same because Russia is energy and food independent. They produce a surplus and export to the world. China is not. China is a net importer of energy and a net importer of food. So if the United States Navy ever stops patrolling the oceans to guarantee China's free trade system, or if the United States Navy, heaven forbid, starts blockading the Straits of Malacca or the First Island chain, China dies within 6 months. If the U.S. Navy just sails off 1,000 kilometers to the south, the east, the north, and just blocks every ship from going to or from China, China dies within 6 months, and China knows that.
You're absolutely right, because China owns or leases something like 10 to 15% of Ukraine's agricultural land, which is one of the reasons why I think China has been so big on Russia not using nukes. So one of the things China has been very consistent on and very open in rhetoric with is Russia don't use nukes. They've actually rebuked Russia a number of times in that sphere. And I think they so desperately need food that they've done a pretty clever strategic thing, which is go around the world and hoover up areas for to either own, lease, or have some kind of dibs in terms of food production. And Ukraine being one of the breadbusters of the world is an obvious choice, but it means that now that Ukraine is being attacked by Russia, China's a little bit compromised. I think my position was China stood to gain more, and I still think this, but I think there are competing things going on. So on the one hand, they're getting cheap hydrocarbons, and I think they're absolutely loving that. But on the other hand, I think they'll gain more if Russia lost, because they would just go, if Russia completely fell apart, China would go in and say, oh, we'll help you. We're one of your mates, right? We'll help you get on your feet. And by the way, we might just have a little bit of this region here. And by the way, we'll help with this oil depot and refinery and et cetera, et cetera. What are your feelings on China benefiting more with Russia losing?
The argument is there for Chinese nationalists, for Chinese netizens and Chinese nationalists who want Outer Manchuria back. Yeah. I forget the Chinese name for Vladivostok, but yeah, China had their century of humiliation from 1850 to 1950, in which the European colonial powers humiliated what was the greatest civilization, the greatest empire for the last 10,000 years. When you think about the glory days of ancient Rome, China was bigger. Even at the time of the Roman Empire, China was bigger, more prosperous. Chinese emperors, claimed there was nothing that they wanted from the rest of the world. China had everything. But when the British, figured out that they could trade opium for tea, 20 million people in China got addicted to opium. The emperor weakened and technologically was at a disadvantage. Russia came from the north, fought wars with China, stole their land, stole their territory. So the argument is there, and China knows it, that overnight they can tell their proxies in their state media apparatus, flip on Russia, and Russia's screwed. So I think I'll give you one of my favorite conspiracies. A lot of people here, I mean, this is really deep state stuff here, but one reason why top Russian military brass, Russian generals, don't want to use nukes against NATO is because they think they might need NATO's help in the future in a war against China. So everything going on in Ukraine, that can be forgiven and forgotten with NATO if China actually attacks Russia and tries to take, everything east of the Urals. The Russians would totally change their tune. I mean, they would obviously assassinate Putin, say, we're never going to do that again. Everything Putin did was a mistake. But you have to help Russia against China. China's the real threat now. They've just invaded outer Manchuria and Siberia. NATO, please help us. Please save us.
Yeah, so there's something definitely in this, because the Russian generals have long been very suspicious of China. They don't like the Chinese. In fact, even though they're members of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, it's a marriage of convenience with, like, India doesn't really get on with China. China doesn't really get on with Russia, but they have a utility for each other. But the Russian generals, I think, at some point during the war, there were some leaks coming out, or some rumors coming out. The Russians weren't very high. The Russians weren't very happy high up in the military echelons with the way the war was going and the dependence on China, that growing dependence on China. And they saw themselves more and more as a vassal state, which they really are, of China. And indeed, exactly what you're saying with Vladivostok, back last year, China got access to Vladivostok in May of last year. There's some approval of transportation that basically, because China are now in a power position, in the driving seat of that relationship, where Russia are basically screwed, and China can say, yeah, we'll buy that hydrocarbons, but we're going to buy it at this price. Basically, they are just, don't want to be too crude, but Russia are bent over the desk, and China is there dictating everything.
Dictatorships don't like each other. Dictatorships love doing business with democracies. They love dealing with democracies because they think democracies are weak and easy to manipulate. When you have these trade negotiations or two-party talks, and there's all these people sitting at a table for a photo op, when it's a dictatorship and a democracy, everybody on the dictatorship side knows they're not giving anything up. They're going to make the most extreme, absurd, stupid demands, because democracies are suckers, and they're always willing to give up concessions for peace, to just get along. But when you have two dictatorships sitting at a table trying to negotiate something, and everyone is lying, and everyone is asking for the maximum demand, because that's the playbook of dictatorships, these people hate each other. They're not natural allies, and they can't manipulate one another like they successfully manipulate democracies with peace talks or trade negotiations or whatever. So yeah, these countries, they know the game they play. They know it's all pony and dance show, or whatever the expression is. But the BRICS alliance is a joke, because they don't have a unified currency, and they never will. Because to have a unified currency, they all have to trust one person to be in charge of the central bank. And nobody trusts China. Nobody trusts Russia. I wouldn't trust India or Brazil either. So if BRICS wants to pound their chest and talk about free trade amongst these countries, okay. But until you unify behind a common currency and trust the Chinese to manage the flow of that currency, you're not a real threat to anybody.
Yeah, I broadly agree with that. Sebastian Spurl says, Jake Broe, ATP Geopolitics. Every day I watch your news and insights about this war. Thank you both. Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. David L says, keep voting, keep donating if you're able. And we have Remy Stevens with some Canadian love. Thank you. I love you guys. I sincerely appreciate the work you both do. Keep it up. A question. What are the chances of getting NATO member countries' feet in Ukraine, or civil contractors support the supply lines and maintenance or repair, etc.? Good question.
Well, there's already so many people in Ukraine, but they're just not maybe uniformed personnel. So there's lots of veterans. There's lots of, I do believe, private contractors that are basically, sub-organizations of the defense industry for European countries and American countries. If the money is there, if the contract is there, if you pay somebody enough money, they will go to a war zone. in order to repair tanks or service communication equipment or whatever. So I love the tone coming from French President Macron. Lots of people just don't
Yeah,
want to
loved
be the
it.
first to do something. So I want to give you massive respect as a Brit, because Britain was the first to do a lot of things, sending the Challenger tank, sending long range cruise missiles. You guys might even been the first to offer Ukrainians to host them on your country, to train them.
Yeah, it was
So
definitely me as well. I was actually involved in all those decisions. So
all
thanks.
you, 100%. So if a country just says we're doing it, we've done it. If French sends their own uniformed personnel as advisors, it's trainers, logisticians, technicians, maintainers. I don't see any country ever willing to put their soldiers in the trenches on the front lines. I'm sorry, Ukrainians are going to have to staff those dangerous roles. But as far as all the support positions, there's no reason why NATO member countries, military personnel from the Baltics, just do it. Estonia said they're willing to do it. Finland said they're willing to do it. You can either fight the Russians on Ukraine's territory to help Ukraine, or you can fight the Russians and the Ukrainians on your territory in 4 or 5 years once they flip on you.
I really, really liked Emmanuel Macron. He had just that purple patch of a week where he was just coming out and saying everything that was right. It was like, we shouldn't take off the table sending troops to Ukraine. And I was like, yes, it's about moving that Overton window. It's like, now it's acceptable to talk about that. And if you normalize that conversation, then when it actually does come to sending troops into training positions or maintenance, then we've got over this and it's more acceptable. And I think there are more and more nations that are starting to say that as well. So I think that's really good. But you can bet your bottom dollar, in case anyone's in any doubt, there are UK and almost certainly US special forces operating in Ukraine. That is just 100%.
Well, this was news this week, but with the passage of this package, Biden has sent 60 additional military advisors to the embassy in Kyiv. And I'm sure these military advisors are being told, help the Ukrainians, one, bring down that bridge, but also use this 60 billion in the best possible way, because Biden could potentially lose this election in November. He used political capital to get this 60 billion passed. And if Ukraine doesn't perform well, if Russia doesn't struggle, then I'm feeling confident, but I'm just giving you the worst case scenario. If Ukraine doesn't perform well after this bill was passed, Donald Trump will attack Biden for this before November. Trump will say, I was not sure about doing this. This was a waste of money. We did what Biden wanted, and look, the Russians are still advancing. This was a waste of money, waste of time.
Really great point.
Elect me. So Biden now he's politically tied his November election prospects on Ukraine stabilizing or pushing back. This is a good thing.
Yeah.
We want the U.S. military more invested.
For sure. I mean, just a few more questions for you, mate. So with many countries, this is from Nico, and thank you so much. With many countries gearing up for a war footing, what should be every country's manufacturing priority for their own defense other than ammunition?
I forget who said it this week, but the debate is, maybe it was Jens Stoltenberg, the director of NATO, but he said, if you have to prioritize two things, one, increasing your own defense production to meet the NATO requirement of 2%, versus just send military aid to Ukraine. Send military aid to Ukraine. You can build up your own military later. Let's defeat Russia first, give Ukraine everything they need, and then once Russia's defeated, if you're still feeling nervous about Iran or China, then work on your own domestic. It's too late now. To work on your
Denmark
own.
did, right? Denmark's done this, and it was just absolutely brilliant. Which is, I mean, I'm sure you were saying. I was saying this at the beginning of the war. What's the point? I said this with the British Challenger tanks. We gave them like 12 tanks, although there were rumors that we given them 24, 28. But we give them 12 tanks, and like, okay, we got like 250 odd Challengers.
Denmark sent all of their howitzers. They sent everything. They don't have any.
those tanks were designed to take on the Russians, right? No one's going to invade Britain. And so, or we might send some tanks off to the Middle East or somewhere. Like, okay, keep some strategic reserve, but like any usable spares, send them to Ukraine. That's who's doing a fight. We're going to be fighting Russia, so they're fighting Russia for us. That's why I say it's functionally a proxy war. Denmark got it, and like, well, we're only ever going to fight Russia, and so you might as well have everything.
Denmark is giving all of their F-16s as well.
Yeah,
they're getting F-35s to replace them, but they're just going to have fewer planes in the short term because there's an urgency now. Yes, that is the correct attitude.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Good answer to that. Someone asking here, do you ever think, where is it, that you are? Here we go. BC says, Jake, have you ever considered entering politics? Is that for you?
I'm 39. Yes, I am interested. Potentially in the next decade, I could try and run for Congress or something, but I mean, no immediate plans. But yeah, someday. Be sure to, follow me on Twitter and YouTube. And it is kind of funny when I look at members of Congress who get elected. First of all, I'll say with Congress, it's pretty random. To be in the right place at the right time, like who gets elected to Congress is pretty damn random, because it's all about timing. In the right district that leans whatever ideology you want to be, someone needs to be retiring or vulnerable, and you need to win a primary and hope nobody with a higher profile is also running in that primary. So it's very chaotic, very random who gets in. Even if I did everything right at the right time, I still might not win. It's a huge investment in money and time with no guarantee of anything. So I understand all that, but I could make a serious attempt at some point in the next 10 years. Yeah.
Well, you'd have one illegal vote from me. So, that's something. Thanks for that question. And Eubanks DVD says, look, Jake, JP, absolutely absorbing conversation, guys. Thank you. Really appreciate that. And just a few quick thanks for Brian Ivey. Really appreciate that. Julian Rossiter, I did show these before. Surprises us. So Lynn in Arizona, who gets to see F-16s training above her head, by all accounts. So that's pretty cool. And Sunka FH, thank you very much. Right. So Jake, is there anything, as we sort of meander towards a close, is there anything that's kind of that you're particularly concerned about or particularly happy about at the moment? Anything you haven't talked about that you think is worthy of mention?
Concerned about or happy about?
Either
just
or.
The passage of this aid package is huge, and I think we're going to get a lot of spectacular news. Russia tries to crack down on these pictures and videos coming out of the occupied territories, but I still think it's unavoidable. It's inevitable. People who take pictures and videos, they got to be careful uploading them to Telegram so they can't be identified. Russia is looking for people who provides this evidence, but it's just such a tragedy, everything that's happened. But I'm hoping this is a wake-up call for Western democracy. I think, given this connection, this bridge between democracy and capitalism, it's so tempting to be complacent with authoritarian regimes, human rights violators, to say, as long as I'm making a profit, as long as I'm getting rich, I can look the other way. I can not struggle with the ethical quandaries of doing business with Russia, China, or even Iran. But we need to name and shame more people. We have to change the culture. We have to change the language we use to describe how democracies interact with authoritarian regimes around the world. Because I don't know if we can put the genie back in the bottle and go back to this 90s paradigm of the United States being the lone superpower, police of the world, 11 super carriers patrolling the oceans, making sure that everyone gets along. But the United States isn't going to do it anymore. And we need more of a global, connected, unified effort from democracies to protect ourselves.
Team America and all that. It's an interesting point that you made there about sort of capitalism. I don't want to get too into economics here, but how we humans aren't very good at doing morality and pitting it when it's pitted against like cost and profit. And so, you know, we don't have moral behavior. It doesn't come easily to us when we are also inherently fairly greedy. And so what you need to do is put things in place. That's why regulation exists. So in economic terms, everyone knows economics. The free market can't arbitrate for morality such as negative externalities. So if you have an external cost to making something like a widget and it pollutes a river, if you're going to make more profit on making a widget by polluting the river, you'll pollute the river unless someone comes up and makes you incur that cost. So otherwise it's the taxpayer that pays for that in cleaning it up, right? So we won't clean up that river ourselves as a corporation unless we're made to. It's kind of where I'm going, and I'm simplifying a little bit. The point is exactly what you're saying, is that if we're going to make money as corporations doing business with dictatorships, then we will make money. This is why there are all these loopholes, and you can sell to this person, to this person, to this person, that person, and you can sell a widget to China or to Kazakhstan, sorry, and Kazakhstan will ship it over to Russia, and lo and behold, they're making a weapon with your widget. So that's what happens. And we need to have careful regulation. This is where our states and our intranational and international organizations are really important for allowing for morality to have primacy in how we go about doing business around the world. Sorry, there's so much in my head to talk about there, but any quick thoughts on that?
People need to go to jail. And, you know, if you're violating sanctions, your freedom has to be taken away. If you know what the law is regarding international sanctions or whatever, sanctions placed by the United States, and you're American, and you still choose to take that person's money using a shell company or some kind of workaround, put that person on trial, send them to prison, take away their freedom, because that's the only way they'll stop. It's the only way they'll stop.
This is your belief about sorting out the immigration issue.
Fines don't work. If somebody makes millions off of illegal trades, and you fine them $100,000 or whatever, they don't care. It's a speeding ticket.
Yeah, that's what I know. You've done some great videos on the border issues in the US southern border, and that's kind of the same thing, which is these people that employ illegal immigrants. If you put them in prison, they wouldn't employ them, so you wouldn't have the demand. And so yeah, that kind of thing. There's a couple of last minute questions got in, Jake. Are you okay to just answer a couple more? I know I've kept you for ages.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Renan Diaz. Renault again says, do you think Ukraine should continue attacking Russia's oil refineries? We did have this one earlier, actually, after this aid.
Yes. So, keep going. Don't stop.
Yeah.
Burn them all.
Javier Alvarez, thank you so much, mate. Always great. And thanks for your help on Twitter as well. Always sending me useful stuff. Question for you both. Given the approved military US aid and increase in EU aid, what do you think Ukraine might achieve this year? Optimistic, pessimistic scenario. Great chat. Hope we can see you both again.
The bridge is gone. I mean, that's a huge achievement, but it's just about making life on the Crimean Peninsula impossible for the existing population. All the Russians who moved there the last 10 years to have a summer vacation home or to get in on the tourism trade, Crimea, and I'm sorry for the Ukrainian population that still lives there, but Crimea needs to run out of food and water, and it needs to depopulate.
It's worth reminding people that it gets its fresh water from Novokakhovka, which is after 2014, the Ukrainians cut that off. And so Russia had a real problem in Crimea with irrigation of crops. It had dirty water. It didn't have enough water supply. That was a really key thing. So one of the first things the Russians did when they came out of Crimea is go to the Dnipro River and secure Novokakhovka and get the canals working again all the way to Crimea. So absolutely, that is super important, I would say. Julian Roster says, Jake, should Russia be booted out of the UN? Please go and watch my video I did with Talaria, where we talked about how Russia technically is not even in the UN. Soviet Union's in the UN. Russia is not in the UN, but it's just there because no one's actually been bothered to sort out the fact that they're not really in it. But anyway, that's another thing.
Important distinction. Should Russia be booted out of the UN? No, anyone can be part of the UN, but the United Nations Security Council, you're right, the Security Council, the seat belonged to the Soviet Union. There's no reason why it should belong to Russia today. when the Soviet Union collapsed, I think there was an opportunity there. Shouldn't have gone to Russia. But yeah, I do think Russia should, if Russia loses this war, there's a regime change, the new people want to deal, then yeah, I think they should give up that seat, and the permanent Security Council members should come to an agreement, and I think it should go to India. Based on geography and population, if we want to make the UN more fair, I mean, I'm not pro-Indian or whatever. I'm just being objective here. It makes sense for India to have a permanent Security Council seat.
Absolutely. I mean, I did a live. Oh, here it is. I did a live with, as I said, Talaria here, called Ukraine War Live Chat with Talaria. Russia isn't even in the United Nations. She's done an absolute load. She's has legal. She's a lawyer by trade and has done loads of work into the legal aspects of Russia not being in the UN. Fascinating stuff that was. And so finally, thanks to F. Garnold, gifting 10 ATP Geopolitics memberships. Really, really kind of you. This one I sort of threw up here, but I took it down. I watched both your channels, says Bruce Granger. Thanks, mate. Thanks for your brilliant updates. One question: why don't they knock out Russia's locomotives? No transport to the front, collapsed logistics. Any thoughts on that?
Destroying rail lines isn't productive because rail lines can be repaired really fast, but you are correct. Maybe locomotives are just really tough and going for it with a drone. But yeah, if I see a train parked and I've got a Gimler's range I don't know why. Maybe it has, and we just don't have pictures. But if a train is parked and it's currently offloading, and you can Gimler's that lead car, the locomotive, it seems like that would be beneficial. But I'm guessing Russia knows this, and when a train with a huge cargo is being delivered, the locomotive probably detaches and then goes somewhere else, like under a shelter or something to be protected. But I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah, my opinion is exactly yours, that railways themselves are really easy to fix. And so it's a waste of expensive missiles. But bridges, that's what you want to take out. So my opinion would be anywhere there's a bridge, take that down, because you ain't fixing that particularly quickly. I don't know about locomotives and how many they will have. I know at the beginning of the war there's talk about ball bearings have been sanctioned and Russia were unable to get hold of ball bearings for rolling stock for their trains, and that's been a bit of an issue throughout the war. I don't know if it still is. I think they're probably getting cheaper ones from China now.
Russia also apparently has a huge shortage of lubricants. And very specific, synthetically produced materials needed for mass producing or mechanized machines. But yeah, apparently there's a huge lubricant shortage for the Russian military. Interesting.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time here so far tonight. I really, really appreciate that. Thank you for the live chats. And all the people very active in those live chats, and JR, who has been curating the live chat and sending me questions so that I don't have to spend all my time looking at hundreds of people saying stuff. So I really appreciate JR. He's a legend, and he does the lion's share of all the mapping that I share on a daily basis. So I really, really appreciate that. Thank you, Jake. Obviously, people can go and find Jake at all the many places he's at. So his YouTube channel, Jake Broe, on YouTube, Broe with a BROE, as you all know, and on Twitter as the real Jake Broe. Are there fake Jake Bros out there?
So I think I actually got the handle Jake Broe, but then I lost the username and password. I then created another account and Elon shadow banned me. So I wasn't searchable and all my traffic was suppressed. So I had to create another Twitter account, and I went with real Jake Broe this time.
Yeah, and don't get me started on Elon Musk. You and I have the same opinion of Elon Musk. And talking about like freedom of speech, of course, he amplifies. He has a code that amplifies his own message. So whenever his own tweets. So whenever you turn on Twitter, you get Elon Musk's tweets first of all. So it's like some people are freer than other people, as his voice is amplified, and he treats. So there was leaked coding last year, wasn't there? Or was it in 2022 that had Ukraine news was put in the same category as disinformation and is down de-amplified, isn't it? And so it's not free speech that he's interested in. It's people saying or listening to what he has to say. But there you go. That's just my tuppence on that subject. There was the very final thing I wanted to ask you, Jake, if you'd be so good. And I'm just trying desperately to find the question. And it was, oh yeah, this was it. And thank you for this question, Lag Monster. How do you guys deal with the emotional toll of being exposed to so much constant propaganda, trolls, idiocy, and I guess horrific things like war crimes and seeing all the footage we see?
So when I get hate comments or pro-Russian comments on my channel, I block that person, and I feel godlike being able to silence somebody, because they're still there. They're still watching my videos. They're still leaving comments. They don't know they've been blocked, so they're just screaming into the void. That gives me satisfaction. But as far as the constant drumbeat of Russian disinformation and propaganda, my North Star, my center point, is knowing that Russia is not going to win this war. I don't have a timetable. I don't have all the details of how it's going to play out. But cosmic justice demands that Russia pay a price for this, everything terrible they've done, really for centuries. And this is the moment in history where the Russians are going to pay. There is zero chance of their nation prospering from this war. And I know that. Yes, it's a tragedy, everything that's happening to Ukraine. Ukraine is suffering. They're unfortunately going to continue to suffer. I want to do everything I can to alleviate that suffering. But what the Russian people are going to experience as a result of this war, all the relationships they've destroyed with Europe and the West, they're in for a worse future. Demographically, economically, their culture is terrible. Their leaders are all corrupt. All of their intellectuals and professionals have fled the country. Russia is screwed. And that's what keeps me going every day, knowing that this is the end result. And there's millions of good people like you and me working towards that end result, and it will happen.
Well, I think that's a beautiful place to end, mate, because it's a place of positivity. We've got the aid packages coming in. Europe's woken up. Yes, we are looking like we're moving into an era of war and of conflict and of international geopolitical hard times. But the hope is that we are becoming more and more prepared for what may eventually take place, or to deter bad things from happening. So yeah, I'm the same as you. I don't think Russia can win, but but at the same time, Ukraine can also not win. So what we don't want is a situation where both sides get a suboptimal outcome. What we want is an optimal outcome from Ukraine, and very much a suboptimal one for the aggressors, for Russia. Look, mate, thank you so much for your time. Thanks to KP for that. Really, really kind. What are your last words, mate, as a goodbye?
Keep defending the truth. Keep defending democracy. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jake, and stay on the line for a second. And thanks for everyone else in the live chat. Really appreciate you spending the time with us. Take care. Toodle pips.